The Dwarf Hold of Karak Hirn, also known as the Horn Hold, is renowned for its exceptionally traditional army composition. When they march to war, Karak Hirn's warriors shun the more outlandish inventions of the Engineers Guild. Instead, they put their faith in Grommerl plate, trusty crossbows, and venerated grudge throwers. A modern Throng from Karak Hirn looks much like any dwarf army would have before Sigmar's empire was founded some 2.5 millennia ago. This conservative approach to war has given the Hornhold a peculiar character of its own, one that's full of flavor and ripe for exploration in Total War Warhammer. As such, I researched and created an army list that represents what the Hold of Karak Hirn might bring to bear against their enemies. I also tested it to see how viable it is in campaign, as is normal for this series. All the tests were done on very hard battle and campaign difficulty, so everyone should be able to take something of value from my evaluation, except for those really hardcore legendary players. Anyways, without further ado, let's hop into it. When fully mustered, the Throng of Karak Hirn is led into battle by its king, Alrik Ranulfsson. Alrik is one of the younger dwarf kings, but his youth hasn't made him any more accepting of newfangled technology than even the surliest of Longbeards. Indeed, he is exceedingly conservative, even by Dawi standards. His adherence to the old ways has earned him the respect of the Karaz elders, and shaped the Hold's army in profound ways. Inventions like gyrocopters, flame cannons, and organ guns are missing from Karak Hirn's arsenal. Instead, the Hold relies upon ancient and dependable war machines like grudge throwers and bolt throwers to bombard their foes from afar. If an enemy somehow manages to close the distance beneath this devastating salvo without losing their nerve, they'll find themselves peppered with expertly placed crossbow bolts. Handguns are still a novelty as far as King Alric's concerned, and he would rather rely upon a trusty crossbow than a fickle black powder weapon. His warriors take after him, and quarrelers are far more common than thunderers in the Throng of Karak Hirn. Any foe that survives this barrage of artillery and small arms fire must then contend with a stalwart wall of steel shields and Grommerl axes. Ranulfsson's traditionalist reputation has earned him the respect of the Hold's Longbeards, and they readily march to war to support their king. Fighting alongside their elders were Karak Hirn's Ironbreakers, hardened veterans of tunnel warfare against the insidious Groby and Skaven beneath the Black Mountains. Any one of these Dawi is a match for the horrors of the Old World, but the greatest warriors of the Hornhold are the Hammerers, found at Alric's side. Acting as the king's bodyguard, as they do in all holds, these warriors use their Grommerl great hammers to smash Karak Hirn's enemies to a bloody pulp. When acting as a whole, few forces can stand against the army of the Hornhold and live to tell the tale. No in-depth overview of the army of Karak Hirn would be complete with at least a cursory glance at its beloved king. Alrik is well deserving of his people's faith, and he has earned every bit of it through word and deed. He possesses a burning desire to settle grudges, even more than typical of his people, and has done an exceptional job doing so. King Alrik eagerly leads the Throng of Karak Hirn to avenge any slight he can, even leaving the Hold's defenses understaffed if it means striking out another grudge. This reckless approach hasn't had any consequences so far, and the rewards have been immense. Perhaps uniquely amongst the Dwarfen kings, Ranulfsson can boast that he has avenged every wrong in one of Karak Hirn's books of grudges. While the Hornhold still has several volumes of unavenged books of grudges to strike out, this phenomenal achievement inspires hope in the Dawi of Karak Hirn and the Karaz at large. King Alrik carries the book into battle, and its presence drives those nearby to fight with unrelenting courage. Its bloodstained pages are proof that, despite the endless woes heaped upon them, vengeance is not beyond the dwarven grasp. While better known for his traditionalist manner and successful grudge settling, Alrik Ranulfsson is also a great warrior. As is common amongst the King of Southern Holds, he is carried into battle by his loyal shield-bearers. From atop his lofty position, he directs troop movements and assesses enemy positions before urging his retainers into the thick of the fight. The shield upon which Alrik stands, Kurgaz's shield, is engraved with protective runes. While too large for any one dwarf to wield, the artifact's magical defenses protect the king and his shield-bearers from harm. Alrik himself is clad in Harapi Clad, the traditional armor of the King of Karak Hirn. This ornate suit of golden armor is marked with a rune of shielding, protecting Alrik from cowardly missile attacks. The suit is augmented by the Helm of Eagles, a magical helmet that grants the King of Karak Hirn exceptionally keen vision. With its enchantments, Alrik can detect hidden or disguised enemies before even the most observant elf, an invaluable skill when battling treacherous wood elves and night goblins. Finally, King Ranulfsson carves through his enemies with the Axe of Retribution. It bears the Grudge and Breaking runes, powerful tools in Alrik's crusade to avenge every wrong done to his hold. The Grudge rune has been inscribed with a specific enemy in mind, making it particularly dangerous against that foe. The Breaking rune, in turn, destroys enemy magic weapons and renders them impotent while Alrik vents his fury against them. With such powerful artifacts at his command, only the most powerful or cunning of foes could hope to match Alrik in a fair fight. The Throng of Karak Hirn is fairly easy to represent in Total War Warhammer. First, as usual, you'll want to look at the characters you'll need. King Alrik Ranulfsson can be represented by a generic Dwarf Lord. While not as interactive as a Rune Lord, the Dwarf Lord does a surprisingly good job in the thick of battle. You can also use the Forge to customize his gear into something roughly approximating Alrik's lore-accurate equipment, something only Dwarf and Tomb King lore-accurate armies can reliably pull off. For the King of Karak Hirn, I have a few recommendations. The Iron Warden's shield is a decent stand-in for Kurgaz's shield, as it drastically increases Ranulfsson's tankiness by improving melee defense by 10 and providing a 10% ward save when he's below 50% of his hit points. While the shield is more mount than armor in the lore, this was the most accurate representation I could find in-game. Speaking of which, Alrik's golden armor, Harapi clad, is easy to mimic in Total War. In the lore, it's been inscribed with the Rune of Shielding, so just give the Lord one of those and you'll have accurately represented the armor of Karak Hirn's king. It gives a paltry 15% missile resistance, which isn't super impactful for a small lord with high armor and a silver shield, but every little bit helps. Plus, not every lord can have the best runes, so at least there's a lore-accurate reason to use one of the worst runes. Unfortunately, Alrik's other magic items are a lot harder to represent in-game. His weapon, the Axe of Retribution, has 2 runes that aren't in the Forge. The Rune of Breaking is a spell in the Runesmith's arsenal, and there's not even a nod to the Grudge rune. Anti-character abilities do exist in-game, such as Wulfric's Hunter of Champions trait, but I suppose they didn't want to add that to a Forge item. Instead, the best replacement I could find was the Dragonslayer's Axe. While Alrik isn't a Slayer, its bonus versus large can proxy an anti-character rule if you squint hard enough. After all, most non-dwarf lords end up on large mounts, so it's a decent workaround. The remaining items are even harder. I don't think there's a satisfactory representation of Karak Hirn's completed Book of Grudges in or outside the Forge. At best, the Ring of Grimnir gives something approaching it, providing an AoE boost to melee attack and leadership, just like the book would, but it also dramatically improves his melee attack and weapon strength, which just feels inaccurate. Alrik Ranulfsson is a fearsome combatant, but he's not in the same weight class as warriors like Khazador Dragonslayer, Thorgrim Grudgebearer, or Ungrim Ironfist. Finally, I couldn't even find an item that's loosely analogous to the Helm of Eagles, so I just ignored it. Once you've armed Alrik, you can move on to the rest of the Throng's characters. First, bring 2 Thanes, as they represent King Alrik's shield bearers. These Thanes would also be protected by the Rune of Shielding as they carried their lord into battle, so you should give each of them a Rune of Shielding as well. Just like the Lord, they do a pretty good job in combat, and when working together or with the Lord, they can punch way above their weight class in duels. If CA ever decides to add shield bearers as a mount, this becomes less necessary, but I still recommend you bring them along. In that case, they'd represent King Alrik's loyal retainers. Finally, to round out your hero slots, bring a runesmith. As you saw above, King Alrik is absolutely encrusted in runic items, and it's crucial that someone knowledgeable in runecraft accompanies the army to make sure they're working at full capacity. Note that you aren't bringing an engineer with the army of Karak Hirn. The Hold has dwarfs capable of crafting and maintaining war machines, but Alrik's traditionalist nature makes it feel weird to take a unit focused around supporting ranged units and artillery pieces. Just be aware this army's firepower won't feel as strong as it normally does in other Dawi armies. Now that the characters have been selected, we can delve into the bulk of the army, Infantry. 2 Hammerers should accompany the Throng of Karak Hirn, acting as the king's bodyguards and smashing their way through troublesome armored opponents. Accompanying them are 3 Ironbreakers, providing a solid wall of Bromrel in your front line. These stalwart warriors are part of Karak Hirn's proud traditionalist approach to war, and no army is complete without them. Rounding out your front line are 4 Longbeards, 2 with great weapons and 2 with shield and axe. Alrik's conservative reputation has drawn many of these battle-weathered veterans to his banner, and a proper army from the Hornhold should represent this. Finally, we round out the army with its ranged contingent. Considering King Alrik's disdain for black powder, a lore-accurate Karak Hirn army shuns thunderers, cannons, and other, more advanced war machines. Instead, you'll want 4 quarrelers, 1 bolt thrower, and 2 grudge throwers to rain death upon approaching foes. These are obviously less impressive than the higher tier missile troops and artillery pieces the dwarfs have access to, but they still do their job perfectly well. Quarrelers can pincushion large or lightly armored targets, bolt throwers are surprisingly accurate with max chevrons, and grudge throwers can flatten elite infantry if properly aimed. As far as gameplay goes, the Throng of Karak Hirn doesn't do as poorly as you might expect from its lineup. Upon realizing I'd be using quarrelers and bolt throwers into the late game, my stomach did sink a little bit, but the army comes together surprisingly well. Bolt throwers and grudge throwers are fairly swingy, doing extremely well for themselves in some battles and barely scraping back their value in others. The quarrelers are more consistent, but their relatively limited ammunition and lack of armor-piercing damage can be a liability against small and heavily armored foes. All in all, Karak Hirn's ranged units are more supplementary than they are in other dwarf armies, especially without that engineer. Fortunately, the front line is so good you rarely feel it. The normal Longbeards and Ironbreakers form a durable front line for your quarrelers to stand behind. The Lord and Thanes are spread out amongst this mass, providing tough little character walnuts in the front line that the enemy can't crack by dedicating characters of their own. I found that Runesmith was best positioned in the center of your lines, letting him support anywhere in your army with his runic magic. The Hammerers are best kept on the flanks so they can wrap around the enemy and get flank charges off once they've fully committed to the fight. Considering I was fighting the AI, this happened more often than not. Finally, the Longbeards with great weapons were kept in deep reserve, guarding the war machines and providing quick support to the quarrelers that were caught by cavalry or hound units. Other tactics may do this better, but this is the one I tried and I found it worked pretty well. While playtesting this build, I was pleasantly surprised with how well the army of Karak Hirn did. It does excellent work against mid-tier Chaos Dwarfs and Scathe when they left their ranged weapons at home, and it smashes through high-tier warriors and Chaos armies. King Alrik and one of his Thanes can even beat down a high-level Archaon, given enough time. Ultimately, the army's extreme defensive stats makes it hard to break with a frontal charge, and the Hammerers and Ironbreakers can actually deal enough damage in melee combat to see off the likes of Chosen. As previously mentioned, the Quarrelers have a bit of trouble with heavily armored infantry, but they can take down anything big, no matter how much armor it has strapped to it. The fact that you don't need gaps in your line to let the Quarrelers fire means you can also form a much tighter defensive line than normal, which may account for the army's extreme durability. Unfortunately, a lore-accurate army of Karak Hirn also has some pretty severe weaknesses. While it does fine against one army at a time, it does begin to buckle when confronted by 2 or more. Its dependence on tanky infantry and limited ammunition to do its damage means it has trouble dealing with an unending horde of bodies, especially if those bodies can do damage themselves. This army also absolutely despises good shooting. While Skaven Slingers and Orc Error Boys aren't exactly much of a problem, Rattling Guns, Chaos Dwarf Blunderbusses, and enemy artillery are extremely hard to deal with. Anything that can put out a lot of armor-piercing range damage quickly or at extreme ranges is extremely hard to counter for the army of Karak Hirn. This is mostly due to the army's lack of powerful ranged tools. Grudge throwers can engage in artillery duels, but they're not good at it. While they're wasting shots against an enemy Plague Claw catapult or Deathstreaker rocket battery, that war machine is killing 5 to 10 Dawi with a single shot. It's also exceptionally difficult to deal with these ranged weapons with melee troops, as all your opponents are going to be faster than you. Nothing sucks more than trying to chase off a unit of Rattling Guns just to see them scurry away to safety. And then you get charged by Rat Ogres. Or obliterated by another unit of Rattling Guns. It can be a bit distressing to watch, honestly. So, with all that in mind, how does the army of Karak Hirn stack up against other armies from a power perspective? It really depends on who you're fighting. As mentioned earlier, it does well against melee armies, but poorly against opponents that can outshoot you. Considering half of your worst enemies rely on ranged firepower to do damage, and the other half don't understand which end of a gun goes boom, this is a bit of a crapshoot. High-tier Chaos Dwarfs and Skaven with artillery and weapon crews are absolute menaces, but most Greenskin and Warriors of Chaos armies will rue the day they decided to pick a fight with the Warriors of the Horn Hold. I'd say this lack of versatility knocks the army rating down a few pegs, but if you properly position it against melee-oriented opponents, you might not even notice it. I'd say its final rating is a solid 5.5 out of 10, though if you subdivide it, it's a 7 against melee armies and 4 against ranged armies. With that, we've completed our overview of what a lore-accurate army of Karak Hirn would look like in Total War Warhammer. This was a cool video to put out, and not just because I love the lore surrounding Alrik Ranulfsson and his peculiar brand of dwarf stubbornness. I'm always happy to get one of these lore-accurate army videos out, as it was how I got into the lore side of the game in the first place. It kind of feels like returning home. I'm also happy whenever one of these armies works better than anticipated. My normal late game dwarf armies are normally full of engineers, organ guns, and thunderers, so it was nice to prove to myself that the early game units could still pull their weight later on. The Dawi don't mess around in melee, even if they're better known for their firepower. I'm not even that good at Total War, so I'm sure a better player could overcome some of the weaknesses I mentioned. That'll be all for today, though, so until next time, this is Sigmar's Chosen, signing off for now.